So lastly, we talked about the special triangle that was the 45, 45, 90 triangle. Today we're going to continue to the 30, 60, 90 triangle. This one's a little more complicated because all of our sides are different, but it is again the same ratio and worth memorizing, just like the other day. Now, on this figure, where we usually get this is when we have an isosceles triangle that has been cut into half. So keep an eye open for that. If we've got an isosceles triangle, we have 60 degrees in all four of the turns. When we drop a vertical here, we've actually created two 30, 60, 90 triangles. So that's when we are going to see this particular triangle. Just like with the 45, 45, 90 triangle, it's all about memorization of these things. It's called 30, 60, 90, obviously, because we have a 30-degree angle, we have a 60-degree angle, and then we have our 90-degree angle. The shorter leg is always going to be opposite of the 30-degree angle. Smaller the angle, the smaller the opposite side. And then the longer leg is going to be 60 degrees. Now, longer leg, because remember the hypotenuse should always be taller. Now, the way I work through these is I always get back to the small. If I have the hypotenuse, I'm going to work my way back to the small. If I have the medium, you'll hear me call it small, medium, and large. But if I have the medium side, I'm going to work back to the small. So it's all about getting back to the small because these ratios that we are going to work with deal with the small. So here is the relationship. The hypotenuse is always double the small side. So if we have the small side equal to n in this case, the hypotenuse is going to be double that, 2n. And the larger leg, and I'll call it the medium side a lot today, is the square root of 3 times greater than the short leg. So if the short leg is n, the medium leg is going to be n times the square root of 3. Now, remember, confusion can set in here because the 45, 45, 90 was the square root of 2. The 30, 60, 90 is the square root of 3. The way I remember this is I have two different sized angles. That's why it's the square root of 2. On this one we have three different sizes. That's why we use the square root of 3. But when we're doing this, what we want to keep in mind is get back to the small side, the side that is opposite of the 30-degree angle. Let's take a look at some examples. We'll try to move through these quickly. So in this case, we have the small side. I know we have the small side because the 30-degree angle is here and the side 4 is opposite of that. So if we go back to our triangle, you're probably going to want to keep it handy for yourself until you get it memorized. I do know this, but if I want to go from the small to the hypotenuse, and again, I'll call it the large size, what we will do is we will take that small side and double it, and that will give us the hypotenuse. So if the small side is 4, the hypotenuse is going to be double that, 8. And if we're going from small to the medium side, all we've got to do is take the small side and multiply times the square root of 3. So in this case, the small side is 4. So we're going to tack on the square root of 3. And this is what we have. Just like when we dealt with a 45, 45, 90, we want to keep our eyes open for radicals that will reduce, but this is not one of those things. When we're given the small side like this, it's much easier. We won't always get this luxury, but again, we always want to be thinking, okay, what is the small side? Again, here we have the small side, but the small side is rational, or has a radical, excuse me. So we know that this is the small angle, it's 30 degrees because the one that's given us is 60. It really does not matter which way you go on this. I usually like to go from the small side, do this one in blue, to the hypotenuse. So what I've got to do is double my small side. Well, in this case, my small side is a weird fraction radical, excuse me, so it's 5 times the square root of 3. So remember, we talked about the oil and water of radicals and whole and integers. The 5 can be multiplied times 2, the square root of 3 cannot. This radical does not reduce, so this is simply the value of the hypotenuse, 10 square root 3. Next thing we're going to need to do is to go from small to medium. And remember, on the small side, we just simply tack the square root of 3 onto the back, and we will have, excuse me, the medium side. So if the small side is 5 square root 3, and then we're going to tack on a square root of 3 to the one that already exists. And this will be the length of our medium side. So the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 becomes 5 square root 9. And the square root of 9 is 3. Now I saw this a couple of times on the 45, 45, 90. Remember, the square root of 9 is not the square root of 3, it is just 3. Radical signs are not to be reused. They're a one and done. They're disposable. So once you take the square root, it is just the number, not the square root of the number. So in this case, our medium side being y is equal to 15. We could do Pythagorean's theorem to check our answers on these. Another smart move, if I were taking my ACT on this is very easy. I would turn all of these values into decimals and make sure that the two smaller ones added up to be larger than the hypotenuse, and make sure that none of the sides are bigger than the hypotenuse, because you may not be familiar with 15 and 10 square root 3, but the hypotenuse has got to be bigger than 15, and 10 square root of 3 is. You could put that in your calculator and see what that number is, but I know that it is higher than 15. So we're dealing with our first one that we do not have the small side, but we always want to keep in mind our small side. So the small side in this case is x. So just like when we dealt with the 45, 45, 90 triangles, we knew that our small side, in order to change that into the medium side, we have to multiply times the square root of 3. Well, in order to move backwards, what we could do is take the medium side and divide by the square root of 3. So really what we have is the small side is equal to the medium side divided by the square root of 3. So our small side in this case is x, and our medium side is 8 square root 3. And we are going to divide that by the square root of 3 to get back to our small side. The square root of 3 divided by the square root of 3 does cancel, so now our small side is equal to 8. And then to move from small to hypotenuse, remember 2 times the small side equals our hypotenuse, so we can do that math in our head. 2 times 8 is 16. Here we are again. We have the medium side. First thing I always want to do when I'm given this is I want to figure out what the small side is. In order to move back, we need to take the medium side and divide by the square root of 3. This is a little bit tougher because we are going to be dividing by a radical. So the medium side is 9, so we need to divide by the square root of 3, and this will give us our small side. I like to do the bump and keep method. I'm going to bump the square root of 3 up there with the 9, and I'm going to keep the radicand of 3. So this is essentially the small side, but it actually does reduce here. 9 divided by 3 is 3, So the small side in this case is 3 square root 3. That would be our value of x. And then y is just our hypotenuse. So all we have to do on our hypotenuse is take our small side and double it. Remember, 2 times 3 is 6. The radical does not change. So our y value is equal to 6 square root 3. So hopefully we're noticing the process is like the 45, 45, 90 figure. It's just our ratios are a little bit different. So we have the medium side. The way we get back to the small side, in this case that's y, is we need to divide by the square root of 3. Well, this value is actually correct, 7 over the square root of 3, but that is not appropriate math, so we are going to bump the square root of 3 to the top and keep the denominator of 3. So this would be our y value, 7 square root 3 over 3. Hopefully you've noticed this pattern. All that changes when we change this hypotenuse is the value that's in front of the radical, if there is a radical. So 7 doubled is 14 square root of 3 over 3. Nothing there reduces, so this is what we have. And then lastly, we're going to work from when we have the hypotenuse. But again, regardless of what we have, we want to go back to the small side. So if the hypotenuse is 16, the small side is half that. The small side is the hypotenuse divided by 2. Most of us are not going to need to do any kind of an equation to figure this out, but half of 16 is 8. So now we have the small that needs to be transitioned to the medium, and hopefully by now we recognize all we've got to do is tack on the square root of 3. So this would be 8 times the square root of 3. We couldn't even have done this one with Pythagorean's theorem because we only had one side. But by memorizing this information, it really speeds things up for us. It's a real benefit for you. So memorize these two triangles, the 45, 45, 90, and the 30, 60. So again, we have another hypotenuse. The temptation is to divide by the square root of 3, but that's not what we have at all here. It would be nice if that's what we had, but we can't. It's not about convenience. It's about doing the correct order. And again, we always want to get back to the small side. So my hypotenuse is this. In order for my hypotenuse to be equal to the small side, what I'm going to have, in this case, that would be y. What I'm going to have to do is to divide by 2. So the small side is actually 9 square root of 3 over 2. That actually does not simplify any. I guess you could technically call this 4.5 square root 3, but that's not a very common occurrence. It's usually going to be left in this fraction form. Before you get all bent out of shape about this question, we did no arithmetic there. All we did is follow the process. There's nothing to simplify here. So don't panic just because these numbers look intimidating. We aren't doing anything with them but moving around. So we're back to our small. Small needs to be transitioned to medium. And remember, it's done that with the square root of 3. So it's going to be 9 square root of 3 over 2. And what we're going to have to do is multiply times the square root of 3. Remember, only in the numerator. It's essentially this. So when we do this, what we end up with is 9 square root 9 over 2. Well, the square root of 9 is 3. Remember, it's not the square root of 3. It is 3 over 2. 9 times 3 is 27. So this missing side over here, x, is 27 over 2. Essentially about 13.5. Again, process was the same. The numbers were a little weird. We've got radicals, we've got fractions, we've got a lot of things that we don't like to see. But if you don't panic, just follow through these steps, you're going to be just fine. And as usual, we've saved the best for last. So we have a hypotenuse that has a fraction and a radical, and we need to convert this into our small side. So remember, what we've got to do is we have got to take our hypotenuse and cut it in half. So it's either divided by 2, or what makes a lot of sense here is instead of dividing, what we're going to do is multiply times the reciprocal of 2, which is 1 over 2. Anytime you want to cut a number, a fraction in half, just double its denominator, by the way, which is what you see happens here. I don't see, whoops, got to copy these things, right? This was a 3, it was not a 2. Quick change. This would be over 6. Still nothing reduces. Nothing reduces, so it's just 5 square root of 3 divided by 6. And in order to get our medium side, we've got to take that small side and multiply times the square root of 3. So the small side being 5 square root 3 over 6. In order to get it to the medium, we're going to multiply times the square root of 3. Five times the square root of 9 over 6. Essentially what we have is 5 times 3 over 6. I put a times there, but it's not a times, it's an equal sign. And then we have 15 over 6. And if you did your math enter, you could reduce this radical that way, but both of these numbers have a factor of 3 in them. So if I factor a 3 from 15, I get 5. When I factor a 3 from 6, I get 2. So the medium side, which is denoted with y, is 5/2. All right, I'm not going to try to tell you that this is as easy as the 45, 45, 90. You've got a lot of things to work with, but the process is the same. And it's just worth memorizing these things. Trust me, you'll want to do that. All right, good luck.